So, hello everyone. After the short break, we have very interesting two technical talks. The first one is from Marco Comosi, and it is about online anomaly detection using statistical leverage for streaming business process events. So, I assume that Marco is ready. Perfect.
Hello,
please.
Yeah, I'm here. So
Hi.
I just share my screen and go.
Yes, please go.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So here it is. Share. All right, and then I will start the presentation here. All right, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to present this paper to you. This is the joint work of me and my student Jonghyun, who would have loved to be here, but unfortunately he cannot be. He's on military training, which here in Korea is a very serious thing, so he's not allowed to leave. And yeah, and therefore I'm here presenting the paper. So what is this paper about? We should look at these slides and start reading from the bottom up. So it's about event log anomaly detection, and the type of anomalies that we want to look for are at the trace level. So defined on the order and occurrence of activities in a trace. For instance, if this is the correct trace, this trace is anomalous because two events have been swapped. And to distinguish the problem that we are facing from a traditional conformance checking, we want to do anomaly detection in a model agnostic way. So we don't assume the existence of a process model or nor the existence of clean traces from which a process model can be discovered. And finally, of course, to have a paper at this workshop, we have to do it online. So the event log is not available as a whole, but as an event stream. How do we solve this problem normally in offline settings? Well, there are three different classes of approaches. Frequency-based, basically we create an intermediate process model or a frequent episode model, and then use some kind of conformance checking technique to detect anomalies. Distance-based, we try to cluster the traces according to some notion of distance and use the distance of a new trace from these clusters as an anomaly score. Or we could use reconstructive machine learning, so we can train some sort of machine learning to learn what are the anomalies. And one example is to use an autoencoder, which is a deep learning network that can reconstruct its own input. So by learning a latent distribution of the input. So in that case, the observations with larger error are the ones that will be considered anomalous. What we do is an approach that we could consider, that we could label information theoretic. So what I'm presenting here is actually the application to event streams of a type of approach that we have developed more in depth in the offline settings. And in this case, what we do is we use traditional measures of information content of observations that we find in statistics and in outlier detection. So in this type of methods, the anomalies are the ones that have an information content that is different from most of the other observations in the data set. And the good thing is that these information theoretic measure, they only work on the data that they have. So they tend to work reliably no matter how many observations we have, which is of course good for online settings. And to be computed, they don't require a lot of data. For instance, we could guess that the quality of the intermediate models that we have here depend a lot on the amount of data that we use to discover this model. And of course, in machine learning methods, the more data we have, the better we can train our deep learning network. So we use this information theoretic approach. And how does it work? Well, the idea is, there are two things that we have to define here. We have to define the anomaly score, and this will be the part more complicated here. And then we have to define an anomaly detection method, so that based on the value of the score will tell us whether a trace is anomalous or not. And in this case, the anomaly detection method that we will see is very simple. It's simply a threshold-based method. What is the information theoretic measure that we use for characterizing observations is the statistical average, which is a very traditional base measure of many outlier detection techniques. So we start from a matrix of observations X, which in our case, an observation will be a trace in the event log. And then we calculate this projection matrix H in this way, and the leverage the leverage of the observations in X are the diagonal elements of the projection matrix H. So this matrix has the same number of rows as the number of observations in X. So the first element on the diagonal will be the leverage of the first observation or the first trace. The second element, the leverage of the second trace, and so on and so forth. This measures is built in such a way that the higher the leverage, the more likely the information content of this particular observation to be different from the one of all the other observations. So in our context, this means the higher the leverage, the more likely an observation to be anomalous. Now, the problem is that, of course, that we need to do some, well, we have to manipulate a bit the event log, because in the event log, the rows are events. So what we receive are events, but in practice, we need a matrix of observations, which is at the level of traces. So what do we do is, if we have a set of events available, we will do some kind of encoding and aggregation. So we are only interested on the occurrence of events in a trace. So we only one-hot encode the events in a trace using an index-based encoding. So we generate features for the first event in the trace, for the second event in the trace, and so on and so forth. And of course, because traces have different length, then we need to add some zero padding for the traces that are shorter, because otherwise we cannot form a matrix of observations. And this introduces what is called this seesaw effect here, which increases the leverage of the longer traces. So what is the problem here? The problem is that the shorter traces here have a lot of zero padded values. So they are, from an information theoretic point of view, they are more similar, because they have a lot of zeros that are similar to each other. So this means that the leverage of these shorter traces will decrease, and in turn, the level of the longer traces will increase. So, and this is something that we want to counter in the anomaly score that we are building. And this is why we introduce a weighting factor. So we don't take the leverage as defined in the projection matrix, but we multiply this leverage times a weight, the value of which is estimated considering the length of each individual trace and the maximum trace length in the traces that we are observing. You know, so now here things are a bit more complicated, and the details are in the paper, but what we do is that we normalize the trace length using the transformation and the sigmoid, like in here, and then we adjust by using these coefficients in exponent, which depends on the maximum trace length in the data set. And we estimated the optimal value of this using a nonlinear regression and 6 real-life event logs with different levels of variability and the number of traces. And so to have an estimate that is pretty reliable on different event logs, you know. And these 6 event logs that we used are not the ones that we use for the evaluation of our approach. So in this way, we have defined an anomaly score, which is basically the leverage of this matrix of observations multiplied times this weight for each trace. And now what we need is an anomaly detection method. And as I said, here things will be very easy because we simply have to define a threshold. And if the value of the leverage of a trace is higher than the threshold, then the threshold will be labeled as anomalous. And we use the 4 different types of threshold, 3 fixed threshold of with values 0.1, 0.15, and 0.2. This because empirically we have realized that normally a good threshold to discriminate between anomalous and normal traces is around these values, but we also use a variable, a threshold which is set to the average of the anomaly score of all the traces plus 1 standard deviation. And we will see that in practice, the results that we obtain are pretty similar with all thresholds. Okay. So until now, we have defined a method that can work in offline settings. You know, if we are given the event log as a whole, we can encode it, we can calculate this weighted leverage for each trace, and we can decide whether the traces are anomalous or not. Now, we have to adapt this to the online settings, and here we need to do some standard tweaks. So we have to define a grace period, so to allow a warm start while collecting events, and this is defined as the number of traces for which at least 2 events have been received. So we start collecting results after we have observed at least this number of traces with 2 events. Then we have to consider a finite memory assumption. And here the parameter W means the window. So the number of latest traces that we consider for anomaly detection. And then we have to define a method for updating the leverage scores as we receive new events, and this is magnified here. So what we do is that let's say that we are let's say that we are past the grace period, so we are up and running, and we receive one event number 300 that belongs to case 70. Then what we can do is we can extend the matrix of observation X with these new events through encoding and calculating the weighting factor. So we can calculate the projection matrix and therefore the anomaly score for each case. And what we focus is on the anomaly score of the case to which this event belongs. And in this case, the leverage value is pretty high, so it's above the threshold. So this case, a 70 will be labeled as anomalous. So at each step, the case to which this event, the event that was received refers, will be labeled as normal or anomalous. Okay. So Yeah, this is basically the approach, and we did some experimental evaluation. We considered the two synthetic event logs, which are usually used in the evaluation of this type of approaches in offline settings, plus one real event log, the help desk log, because it's pretty small, so it was easy to handle, you know, in terms of time for running the simulations. And we took these event logs and we injected anomalies randomly, 5 types of anomalies until we reached 10% of anomalous traces. Here you can see the type of anomalies that were injected, very simple ones that are commonly used in this type of research: to skip an event, to rework, to insert, and to move an event. And these I mean, this can be done forward or backward. So this counts ×2 in the count of the types of anomalies. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And of course, while we inject anomalies, we can also label the traces, whether they are anomalous or not, which means that in practice, this becomes, well, we can evaluate the results as a classification problem. No? So we consider as values for the grace, these values for the grace period and for the window, and we will compare the accuracy, the recall, and the F-score on the whole stream and on the first and last 100 events, but we will see the results in one minute. Here, let me do a little bit of advertising. If you think that these type of anomalies that are injected are not complicated enough and they don't look real enough, then you are correct. But these are normally the type of anomalies that are considered in the literature. But if you don't think these are real enough, you can check out our demo of the tool named AirBagel tomorrow, in which we have developed a simulator that can inject more complex anomalies into event logs that are modeled based on a study of the literature on event log data quality that we have done. And as you can see here, some of these anomalies are the simple ones that I showed before, but some are a bit more complicated. But if you're interested, please join tomorrow. I don't know what time in Europe, but you know, join for the demo session tomorrow. Let's go back to our thing here. So these are the results here. It's a lot of numbers, but what are the takeaways? Well, so here we see the average performance from the beginning of the stream once the grace period has been passed, and the numbers here look pretty bad, particularly on the real log, the help desk log. But this is mainly because this is an average on the entire stream, so from the very beginning and until the end. But if we look at, if we compare the performance on the first 100 events after the grace period and the last 100 events in each experiment, then the results look much better. You know, and it can be seen that particularly in the case of the real log, there's a trend from, you know, from nothing, so the performance is flat, to a decent performance in the last 100 events. So it really looks like once the system is in a steady state, then this anomaly detection method works well. And this is just to give you an idea of why this happens. This is a plot in time as the number of events received increases of what happens with one of the two synthetic logs, I think, if I remember correctly. And you can see clearly that until some point in the experiment, the performance varies quite widely. And then things tend to stabilize, and we have an upward pattern towards better performance. And yeah, that's it from me. Where the experience was that this was, I mean, the world of streams was a totally new world for us. So we have learned a lot while doing this, and we are still learning. And where do we go from here? So we want to develop a better threshold that can adapt better to the length of the different traces. There's a problem of performance, because for calculating this leverage, the big problem is to invert these observation metrics, this X, which may take a time. And by using some kind of embedding, we can, while encoding the events, we can reduce the size of the matrix X and clearly improve the performance. And also, the approach that we propose here is very simple in the sense that it doesn't distinguish whether you know, a trace is complete or incomplete, and often, particularly at the beginning, traces may be considered anomalous because they are actually incomplete. You know, and so what we want to try, what we are thinking of doing is to use some kind of prefix length bucketing. So the idea is to have different models for traces at different prefix length. So all the traces for which we have received 2 events, 3 events, 4 events, and so on and so forth. And this should increase we guess that, and since all of this can be calculated in parallel, then the time performance can improve, and at the same time we should be able to have a much more accurate model. Yeah, I guess that's it. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the nice talk, and congratulations also for your student on the paper. Now it's time for questions. Mark. Andrea, please go on.
Yeah, so thank you, Marco, for your nice paper. I have just maybe a couple of clarification. The first is that I think slide 15, or where you had the chart, you show this tendency to improve. No, the following one, actually. Yeah, so I was wondering, these the time needed to improve, is this given by the gracing period that you have, by that parameter?
I think the answer is no. I'm not 100% sure because I should consult with my student, yeah. But I'm no, because I think all the results that we show are so the results are calculated only after the grace period has been through, has expired. Yeah, so so what we see here, I think is not due to the grace period, but I guess it's due to the fact that at the beginning there are lots of traces that are incomplete, and so of course, yeah. You always get an output from from your tool, but you cannot trust that output because it is based on traces for which you only have a very few events.
Yeah,
that's why comparing only traces with the same prefix length, we haven't tried yet, but should we guess that it should lead to better performance, because at least you compare traces at the same you know, that
Yeah.
saying
I see.
Yeah.
I see. And do you have an explanation about those spikes for the precision, but also for the F1 and the recall, actually? Because as you mentioned, the log is not that turbulent, I would say. So do you have any idea why that's the case, or not really?
No, as you can see.
Yeah.
I can guess it's the window size after 2000. It's deciding the spikes that we have down.
Yeah.
Could be. Yeah.
And yes, and probably that combined with the fact of having a lot of traces incomplete. Yeah. And then maybe you get a new event and everything changes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marco.
Yurik, please.
Yes, thank you, Marco, for your nice presentation. I was wondering, so if I understand correctly, you make sort of, you decide on the anomaly score on multiple occasions for a certain case, right? Whenever an event comes in, you compute this anomaly score. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it might be that at some point, maybe earlier or maybe later, I'm not completely sure about this, and a case is considered to be anomalous because of a high anomaly score, and at a later point it is not anymore, or vice versa, right?
Yes.
So how do you, so in your computations of your M1 and recall and precision, how do you, so which of those do you actually use then? Do you know?
That's a very good question. I think what we do is that, I mean, what we have shown is so with each new event, we calculate the average. For instance, let's consider accuracy. You know, so one performance indicator. With each new event, we calculate the average accuracy on all the cases that we have at that moment. And then what we show in the table is the average of these values on all the events.
Okay.
Not sure.
Yes. Yeah. So would that mean that you would have multiple of these? So some of the cases will be included multiple times then, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Because we consider all the cases each time. Yes.
So the other question about this is, maybe I don't understand the anomaly score, the actual computation, but do you actually remove these cases that have been deemed anomalous at the point where you compute anomaly score for new cases? Because if I understand your metric correctly, this would actually also increase the. So first question is, do you do this, and if so, or if not, or if not, why?
No, we don't remove those cases because the idea is that this indicator that we see here is, it works in the sense that given a number of observations, this indicator that you can extract is a leverage. It tells you, well, it's an indication of how much each observation is far away from the other ones. So we should always keep all the possible we should always keep all the observations that we have inside the computations, because otherwise, if we remove what we have discovered or labeled to be anomalous, then something that is not anomalous but not very similar to the others may become anomalous. So you should always consider all the observations that you have.
But if you if one of these cases would be considered anomalous, and there's another one which is slightly more resembling the rest of the data, but it's not ticked off as anomalous because there is still an even worse anomaly, right? Which you did detect because it has a right. And if you remove that, then you also have this second anomaly, which is slightly more similar to the rest of the data, which you will be detecting. So I'm completely I don't completely understand this age value, of course, but my intuition would be this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I see the point, and also I must say that, I mean, yeah, it's something that we could try in the sense that right now we trust that. So we trust that the best way to calculate this leverage is always to consider everything, but it could make sense. It could be interesting to investigate what if we remove, for instance, the cases that are clearly anomalous.
Yeah.
You know, that's a good point. It's something that we can try. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't have a, how can I say, a theoretical justification or a gut feeling of why and whether this should work or not. But for sure, it's something that could be tried. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I have one quick question from my side. I hope it will be the last. The comparison to it, so it looks very appealing. We're talking about distance-based, let's say, anomaly detection. Think about clustering, right? So I understood that in the literature there is one approach that is using clustering to detect, let's say, the class of anomalies. Did you try to compare yourself to that approach?
No, not in this case. I mean, we did in the in the offline setting, we have a paper currently well under review, in which we compare our method, which is based on this idea with a few more tweaks, optimizations on the parameter values, and so. And we compare this with other methods in each of these free families that we see here. And it's, I mean, there's, there's no clear winner in a sense. So we cannot say that
Okay.
that our method is clearly so much better, but I mean, we have identified some tendency of what works better.
Nice.
Or, the problem with clustering in general, it's always that as I remember, if I remember correctly, is normally very sensitive to the parameters that are used for identifying clusters, like the number of clusters and so on. And that could be a problem. I mean, the hyper parameter optimization could.
Well, there are always a possibility of sticking to a density-based clustering, where you have still some new, let's say, parameters, but things are probably a little bit less sensitive. But thank you very much for your presentation and for your answers. I have to move to the next talk.
Thank you.
And this is the concept drift detection on streaming data with dynamic outlier aggregation, presented by Ludwig Zenner. Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Marwan. Let me quickly share my screen. So I assume everybody can see my screen?
Yes.
So thank you. So thank you very much for having me at this workshop. I'm very happy to talk about our paper on concept drift detection on streaming data with dynamic outlier aggregation. And this is a joint work with my research group at the LMU in Munich, Germany. So let's get a quick overview of my talk. First, I'm going to introduce two motivational examples to get a feeling for the goal we are aiming at, and then I'm going to explain some preliminaries which are useful to fully understand the approach. And thirdly, I'm going to describe the approach by using a graphical overview and by splitting up this overview into its steps. And after that, the setup for the experiments is described and the corresponding results. And those results will lead me to the limitations of our approach and a short summary with prospects for future work. So let's get right into it. As the title suggests, the goal of this paper is to perform a concept drift detection on streaming data. And for the first example, we are looking at a system infection scenario where the evil goal is to recruit system for botnet. And there is a constant growth in the area of Internet of Things, where various devices are connected. And we already heard about that today in the keynote talk, and that there is a demand for efficient solutions. So this growth of this area poses a threat for each of those devices, since they have to be protected from unauthorized access. And since this is not always possible, we could look on command execution level to distinguish between intended commands and various types of malicious incoming commands as a process. Another scenario would be the spread of a disease, which is more of a theoretical example. Sometimes if a patient got infected by a disease, it's advantageous to keep health journals to keep track of which symptoms a patient is suffering at what point in time. And if we take those health journals of infected patients as a basis, we could see every journal as a process instance. And for example, the first patients seem to have similar repeating symptoms like fever, fatigue, or dry cough. And some have fewer days with symptoms, and others have mild or maybe more severe symptoms. And over time, other symptoms occur which possibly indicate another type or subtype of this disease. And these other symptoms, which are shown in red, for example, itchy toes or loss of senses of smell and taste, could pose some kinds of deviations of the discovered disease process. And thus, a further classification could be advantageous. So in any case, to detect non-conforming process instances, which are process instances which we cannot already assign, we need a reference model. And with this reference model, we decide which process instance is non-conforming. Furthermore, what we are interested in are clusters of non-conforming traces and not singular instances, because those clusters implicitly represent instances which are worth reacting to because of their number and similarity. And this reaction could be an integration of the deviation, for example, with a symptomatic therapy in the second example I talked about, or precautionary measures in the first example. What we can see here is that deviations in one of the first places in the Petri net occur more often than deviations at the end, for example. And this means that we see the trace AADEF and DAEF more similar to each other than to the trace ABCG on the right-hand side. So how do we determine the similarity of those non-conforming traces then? For our purpose, we are using the average linkage between every non-conforming trace. And this means that we only look at the transitions with problems in each non-conforming trace and compute the average distance. For the distance computation, we simply project each event onto the reference model and count the hops between the activities. So you can see an example at this slide. You have the trace and only the transitions which pose problems to the conformance checking. So for example, you have the transitions A, D, and E, and you compare them with a trace with the transitions with problems which are B, C, and E. So you project them, for example, on this Petri net, and then you can count the hops in between those transitions with problems. So now that we defined the distance between each trace, let's recall the density-based outlier detection, which we use to detect relations between each non-conforming trace. And we want to compare the density of a trace with the density of its neighbors, and we want to derive a degree of outlierness. And to achieve this, we use the local outlier factor by Bräunig et al. So therefore, we need two important terms. First, we have the k distance, which is the distance of a trace to its kth neighbor. So for example, in the graphic on the right-hand side, given k equals 4, and some points, which are labeled P, Q, and O, then the kth neighbor, the fourth neighbor of P is Q, for example. And second, we need the reachability distance, which is the k distance of P here in the example, or the real distance of O, of the point O to P, whichever is greater. And here on the right-hand side, in this case, it would be the distance between O and P, because it's the greater distance. And with those definitions, we can derive the local outlier factor. At first, we compute the average reachability distance, which is basically the distance between the k nearest neighbors to our trace on average. And then we can determine the local reachability density, which is the inverse of the average reachability distance of a trace. So that's the second formula. And finally, we compare the local reachability density of our trace with the local reachability density of its neighbors, which means we take the average of the local reachability densities of the neighbors of our trace, divided by the local reachability density of our trace, and then we get a degree of outlierness of a trace. So a value of around 1 means that we have a similar density of our trace compared to its neighbors, and a value significantly higher than 1 means that we have a lower distance, so the trace is an outlier in some sense. So how do we use this? Let's get to the framework itself. In the next few slides, I will split up this overview into its steps. Let's start with the initiation phase. For the framework, we assume that we have a stream of already gathered traces instead of events, and this makes it easier to show what could be achieved. And you can see a timeline, and the dots on the upper right show the traces in the stream. So to initiate that framework, we have to discover a reference model, where the condition is to have a model as it is intended at this point in time. And this could also be achieved by a given normative model. But even if there are erroneous traces, the approach could also be applied, given that incoming traces are deviating somehow from our reference model. So to go over the trace stream, we use a sliding window-like approach in which we consider traces based on the starting timestamp. In the iteration phase, we first check the conformance of our incoming trace with the reference model. And for this, we utilized token-based replay to be able to detect the transitions which cause problems. And as I already said, in the next steps, only the non-conforming traces are considered, which you can see here with the red number 3. Now, we want to detect a possible relation between traces in the sliding window. So we have to compute the average linkage distance between the incoming trace and each trace in our sliding window. And based on this distance, we can compute the local outlier factor of the new trace. And it is also necessary to compute the local outlier factor of each trace, which is already in the sliding window, because those values could possibly change when a new trace is incoming. And exactly this is the indicator for us to determine if a trace or if traces are related to each other, because when we look at traces with a high outlier factor, this value can drop over time when there are new incoming traces which are similar to those outliers. So this means that the local reachability density increases. So we set a threshold, which is the yellow line in the graphic on the upper left side, and the red arrows indicate a drop of the local outlier factor of some traces below a given threshold. So therefore, in the last step, which is labeled with the number 4, if the outlier factor drops for a minimal number of points below this given threshold, we use those traces to discover a microcluster process model. Now, we covered nearly all steps of the framework to detect microcluster in non-conforming traces on trace streams. But one step is missing. We should not forget, since we possibly discover many microcluster models, we have to extend our second step in the iteration phase. And not only we want to check the conformance of an incoming trace to the reference model, but also we have to check this incoming trace then to the discovered microcluster process models, because there we could somehow classify the new incoming trace. For example, when we go back to our botnet scenario, we are able to assign incoming traces to different types of manipulations. And additionally, for every new trace, as this it's a sliding window, an old one is deleted from the sliding window if this maximum size is reached. For the experimental setup, we evaluated our approach on 2 event logs. The first one we created synthetically by using the process and logs generator by Andrea Burattini. And we created 1 reference process and 3 deviating processes with the evolution function of this generator. And each of the logs have 1000 traces. And then we created 1 log out of those by injecting drifts. We did this by splitting up and interleaving parts of all 4 processes with various interdrift distances. So for example, we used an interdrift distance of 50 by consecutively arranging 50 traces of each process into 1 log. And we did this with different interdrift distances like 50, 100, 250, up to 750 traces. Furthermore, we used the BPIC dataset of 2015, which consists of a building permit application process of 5 Dutch municipalities. And for the process discovery step, we used the heuristic miner with a dependency threshold of around 0.8. At first, we analyzed the F1 score on the synthetic log, which is derived by the correct identification of a trace as related to a microcluster. And with an increasing interdrift distance, on the left-hand side in the plot, we see an increasing F1 score, which can be explained by the number of recurring drifts we had to detect. And this means with a smaller interdrift distance, there are many recurring drifts, which leads to less drifts being detected. And we also see a slight increase in the average execution times when we increase the sliding window size in the plot on the right-hand side. And this is due to the increased number of traces for which the local outlier factor has to be recomputed in each iteration. So the execution times also depends very much on the dependency threshold of the discovery algorithm, because a big process model slows down the conformance checking steps, even for token-based replay. So combined with an increased sliding window size, for example, of size 500, we had a severe increase in the duration per trace, which then led, especially in the case of experiments with the BPIC dataset of 2015, to some limitations. I will go into detail on the next slides. But first, here we can see a Gantt chart where we have the non-conforming traces on the x-axis and the microcluster identifier on the y-axis. So the black lines indicate the change in the process. So here we have a interdrift distance of 50 in the Gantt chart on the left-hand side, and an interdrift distance of 750 on the right-hand side to illustrate the following results and arising problems. Back to the left-hand side, we can see that most of the traces are correctly assigned to the microclusters they belong to. Because as I already said, we had one reference model and 3 deviating processes. And the first 50 traces are mostly assigned to the reference model, and that is why they are not shown here. But we can also see unexpected behavior since some new microclusters are created instead of the assignment to an existing one. So for example, you can see the red microcluster with the number 3, or the microcluster with number 4, or even the microcluster with the number 5 is not expected. And this could be caused by an overly restrictive process discovery step, and new traces are wrongly tagged as non-conforming. And the right-hand side shows that for each deviating process, 2 microcluster process models are created. And this shows the dependency of the sliding window size and the parameter k, which represents the number of points at which a new microcluster model is created. So one can say, if the difference between the parameter k and the sliding window size is high, we detect many microcluster models where only one is expected, and a low difference leads to a very low sensitivity against concept drifts. We also use the BPIC 2015 dataset for experiments where incremental drifts are expected in the data, and due to the high variability in the activity domain, there is a high distance between the traces and our approach, which consecutively detected microclusters. And also the increase of the size of the sliding window did unfortunately not lead to an assignment of traces to already discovered microclusters. And possible reasons could be that the dependency threshold was too high, or by decreasing the dependency threshold in the process discovery step and increasing the size of the sliding window, the approach was significantly slowed down. So we created a hybrid version of this dataset by randomly injecting traces which are foreign to the process. And here we again detected the foreign traces which were assigned to one single microcluster. So I already addressed some of the limitations of our approach. K is the minimum number of local outlier factors in the sliding window with size W, which have to drop below the threshold T. And if we have a high difference between the parameters K and T, then we detect many very small microclusters and concept drifts. And if we have a low difference, then we have a very low sensitivity against concept drifts. We use the heuristic minor, where the dependency threshold also is a limiting factor, since the execution times and the recall are affected by the size of the process model. For example, if we increase the dependency threshold, we get a higher number of traces marked non-conforming, which again have a low distance between them, and thus they are clustered together. Currently, we also are limited to the control flow perspective of the approach to detect concept drifts in. To sum it up, the aim of our approach is to detect non-conforming microclusters and to be able to subsequently classify new deviating traces. Due to the clustering, the analysis of concept drifts is simplified, and the detected clusters pose the possibility to first adapt the process. For example, in case of a change in the disease process, we could adjust symptomatic therapy, or in the first example, we could also prevent an infected system from malicious behavior. And for further research, we focus on the application, not only on streams of traces, but also on the application on event streams, where we have to plan on unfinished traces and the inaccuracies which arise in the conformance checking step and in the outlier aggregation step. We also would like to include other attributes besides the control flow perspective, and this could be possible for the time perspective or for resources and so on. And this adaptation totally depends on the modification of the distance function. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ludwig. Very interesting talk. Questions? Okay, I have one. So I understand now that LOF is one of the bottlenecks, right, in your approach. So there is a clear problem here that you are using LOF over the whole sliding window, and you say that I want to apply it over all the traces there. Mm-hmm. So what happens when you reach a point where your window contains maybe thousands of open cases together?
So you mean
this? Yeah.
So you mean if the sliding window size, we have a maximum sliding window size of 1,000 traces, and the recomputation takes too long.
I don't know how you select the window size. Is it like with the number of traces that you, or open cases that you have currently, or is it like with the time, simply like the time, how many events you have?
That's simply a fixed number of traces we use, and if a new trace is incoming, then we throw the old one out. But other methods would also be beneficial. For example, the Edwin approach would be a good point to apply here, I think.
Okay, can you reflect on the LOF part? Is it really the bottleneck?
I don't really think that the LOF part is the bottleneck, but it's very important to select the parameters K and T, and that's a much bigger problem, I think, because you don't always know which. So you need the parameters K and T, and you need the threshold for your local outlier factor, and that's not always, you don't always know about the local outlier factor values of your traces. So a good approach would be to first look into your sliding window, and for example, which I have here, you could plot those local outlier factors, and you can see what's the average of your traces, and then you could simply set your threshold and the other parameters according to the local outlier factors of your traces. Mm-hmm. So that's the part which could be problematic, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So one final remark, maybe. So you are focusing on conforming versus non-conforming traces, and you are dealing with them separately. But we have like numbers, right? So we have all the possibilities of non-conforming traces. And then is there any way of dealing with them according to this numerical non-binary values?
I don't know if I understood you right. So
the idea is instead of like dealing with two really like classes of traces, we look further and we see, okay, there are non-conforming traces, but the non-conformance is so low value that we need to look, let's say, differently at those part of traces, not put them in one, let's say, group.
Mm-hmm. I think those traces would not be considered in this approach, because those traces which are real outliers, so there are no microclusters, will not drop below the threshold. So I think they will be thrown out. But yeah.
Okay, I see a question from Andrea. Please go on, Andrea.
Yeah, not sure how much time we have, but thanks, Ludwig, for the nice presentation. Yeah, very quickly, I was just wondering, because you mentioned that you assume to observe whole traces, right? So you touched upon this in your very last slide as a possible future work. So could you just give an idea, an intuition of what would be the challenges in dealing not with whole traces, but just with subsequences? So either prefix or, you know, substrings of a trace. And of course, I'm not talking in terms of discovery or conformance, because those are probably two very big problems in themselves. But what are the challenges in your with respect to your approach on this regard?
So if we take only some few events, we check them. You said we classify them as non-conforming, and then it gets to the part where the local outlier factor is applied. The local outlier factor does not depend on how much events we have in our trace. So we could also use unfinished traces, but the less events we have, the more inaccurate will be the distance function for those traces. And thus, the more inaccurate the local outlier factor will be. So the classification into microclusters, or the clustering into microclusters, is not that accurate anymore. I think that's the main problem.
So it's a whole degradation of performance, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. We will meet now. It's a shorter break at 2:45 again to continue with our program. So see you soon.